The Russian government has admitted that conscripts have been used in an invasion of Ukraine, despite a promise by President Vladmir Putin that only professional soldiers will take part. The announcement was made by the Defense Ministry spokesperson Igor Konashenko. Meanwhile, more humanitarian corridors have been opened up for safe evacuation of people in Ukraine. The Russian Defense Ministry says corridors from Kyiv, Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkov and Mariupol will be opened for 12 hours on Wednesday, but the planned evacuation from the town of Izyum in the eastern Kharkiv region was delayed by Russian shelling. Ukraine's foreign ministry said some 400,000 residents could not leave Mariupol due to shelling. Okay, well, to talk a little bit more about this, joining us from Germany is Professor Markus Ziener, who is a senior fellow from the German Marshall Fund of the United States. A very good evening to you, Markus, and thank you so much for speaking to us. So let's just first start with this 12-hour restive period, the ceasefire that's been agreed to with Ukraine to allow citizens to evacuate. There have been many other agreements before, but it seems they have failed to take hold. How hopeful are you that this one will work?
Well, thanks for having me, and good evening from Berlin. It's a mixed picture, actually. We see that today, on the one hand, I think in a couple of places like Sumy, as you just mentioned, and other cities, the corridors worked and helped people getting out of the conflict zones. But that at the same time, we're getting news from what's happened in Mariupol in the south of Ukraine, which is an embattled city and where obviously a hospital, a children's hospital, actually had been hit by mortars and caused death and damages. So it's quite a mixed bag we're seeing here.
And just in terms of the ceasefire agreement, is it specific enough as to what is expected of both parties? Because we know there's been accusations and counter accusations of both parties not holding up to the agreement. Russia has been lashed out at actually hitting aid convoys and, plotting to hit civilian areas. So is it specific enough as to just the ceasing of shelling, and in what areas, at what period? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, we have to kind of imagine the situation for the people in those regions. I mean, not only in Mariupol, as I just mentioned, but also in other places, where they're cut off from water, cut off from electricity. It's pretty cold actually in Ukraine. It's snowing, and so it's a very dismal situation for people still staying in these places. Now, I think you have to do something about that. I mean, you don't have to, but that's what the Ukrainians are demanding. It's extremely difficult to verify what really is happening on the ground, since you have to rely on reports coming in from the one side or the other side. There are only just a few correspondents still in Ukraine who can tell you what's going on. So in a sense, it's a little bit of guesswork, and we really don't know what exactly is happening.
And as you say, the guesswork is also on the part of those who are reporting about it, because of the limited information, particularly from what colleagues say of the defense departments, units of both countries. At some point it was said that Sumy was the more relative successive point in terms of the ceasefire agreement, but for there to be an agreement around this must suggest that the humanitarian corridors are not working as they should. What do you see as the major obstacles?
I think it all comes down to credibility, and the question is whether you trust the other side to really do what they say. And credibility of Russia is, I would say, it's down to zero. If you remember how many times Russia has pledged to not invade Ukraine, and they actually did that in the face of foreign leaders like Mr. Scholz from Germany or Mr. Macron. And then it actually happened exactly this, that Ukraine was invaded. So the same thing applies to humanitarian corridors. If you agree on something like this, you have to be sure that both sides are playing by the rules, so to say. And I think there's a lot of mistrust going on right now.
So just watching briefings across the continents, and I'm talking about Europe and the United States, and of course what the partners are saying, it's also about the movement of military support for Ukraine. I want to talk about beyond that, the preparations that many of Ukraine's neighbours will have to make in order to accept migrants, what position that also puts them in.
Yeah, I mean, the brunt of the refugees so far had to be taken up by Poland. There is a huge influx of refugees pouring into Poland. Poland is part of the European Union, means that there are no restrictions in terms of visa restrictions. Travelers from Ukraine can come into to the European Union basically on a tourist visa and can stay for 90 days. Only after the 90 days period has expired, they have to ask for a visa. So that's one of the reasons we don't have an exact kind of rundown of who had been coming into the European Union, into Poland, and traveling further on to other countries, because there is no requirement actually to register for Ukrainians coming into Europe, into the European Union. I've been to here in Berlin to the central station twice in the last couple of days, and I've to get an idea of what's going on. Berlin has become one of the key kind of places where you see Ukrainians coming through Poland and then actually entering into Germany, and then they end up being here in Berlin. We're talking about 10,000 refugees per day arriving here in Berlin. And yeah, I mean, Germany is reminded of what happened in 2015 with the big refugee crisis. And so I think to a certain degree it helps that we still have the structures in place and we know how to handle that.
And you mentioned that most of it has fallen on Poland, but as I mentioned, there's been talk about surrounding countries, and I want to talk about specifically Hungary, the Czech Republic, who've also been seen as strategic of extra support that may be required. At what cost do countries do this, provide support for fleeing refugees, for military support? Russia has said very strongly that it'll turn its attention on anybody it deems to be playing a part in crossing the red line. Is the fear that there could be retaliatory action by Russia on some of these countries?
Well, if it comes to refugees and accepting refugees coming in, that's from my point of view, that's not a red line. That's to be crossed here, because you have to say, I mean, basically what I just said about the European Union and Poland. I mean, this applies also, of course, to Romania and Hungary also being members of the European Union in terms of letting Ukrainians into the country. It's just a matter of how many Ukrainians are coming in. They're definitely coming more to Poland than to any other country. Not only because they have the biggest kind of land border with Ukraine, but there are also historical ties, family ties. There is a kind of a proximity of culture. Parts of Poland are now Ukrainian, like Lviv, Lemberg, in the west of Ukraine used to be part of Poland. So that's a very close interconnection between these two countries. That's not the case to such extent with other countries. So, but since they're all European Union members, the rules apply to all those countries the same way. I don't think that they are afraid by taking in refugees of overstepping a red line that might provoke Russia from doing something.
So just in terms of the military offensive, the importance of the Black Sea port in regard to the war, what do you see that as?
Yeah, if you look at the map and where the military action is taking place, you see that the most impressive, so to say, advances by the Russian military have been made in the south at the Black Sea. Now, why is that so important for Russia? I mean, they want to probably that's what I see. They want to cut off the eastern part of Ukraine from the western part. They probably want to split the country in two parts, and so I think the idea is to get a connection between the troops coming from the north and the troops coming from the south, and to kind of cordon off the east, and also to cut off Ukraine from important ports in on the Black Sea. I think that's one of the strategic goals of Russia. Now, I think what we have to discuss is what is this strategy of Russia? What is the ultimate goal? Do they want to control all of Ukraine? Do they only want to control the separatist regions, Lugansk and Donetsk, and well, Crimea they already control? What is the ultimate goal? That's something we don't know at this point.
So just to conclude, as diplomatic efforts continue, we've heard that Ukrainian President Vladmir Zelensky has said that he's open to negotiating not only membership of NATO, but also Russia's recognition of the independence of Lugansk and Donetsk. But one of the things he says is, if you're going to talk about autonomy, then the question has to be about who belongs where and who wants to belong where. The role of ordinary citizens, not only in Russia, but in Ukraine, in helping to quell the tensions, to bring about peace, what do you see it as, and how much leverage do they actually have?
Yeah, I mean, there's some movement, as you just said, in terms of where is probably Zelensky willing to concede something to Russia and where not. And we're seeing that he's saying, well, neutrality of Ukraine is something that is feasible. I mean, that also comes from, I think, some disappointment that he has with regards to NATO, because, I mean, NATO made pretty clear that a membership in NATO is not something that's going to happen anytime soon, no matter the current situation. So that's why he probably has kind of left this behind and is talking now openly about neutrality. But talking about Lugansk and Donetsk in the east, the Donbas region, actually where I traveled to in 2020, I mean, those regions, to accept for Ukraine that that they are becoming independent is, I think, a red line. I'm not sure they're going to cross this bridge. They probably are willing to accept a certain status, to accept that they are autonomous. That's probably something that he's willing to concede, but I cannot believe that he's really kind of giving it away. And the same is actually true for Crimea as well.
All right, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it and your insights. Professor Markus Ziener is Senior Fellow from the German Marshall Fund of the United States. When we return after the